Are you a robot?
All right. So let's start out with this right here.
Okay.
What the hell is going on here, Charles? No wonder you wouldn't let me text you. That is what this man is working with. What year is this from, first of all? And does it have snake on it?
No snake, and it's from 94.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, so it's as old as you are.
What? Yeah. It's amazing it's still in the shape that it's in. It's one of these ones that, for everyone listening, it has an antenna that you can pull up to get better reception, I presume.
It doesn't make any difference as far as I can tell.
So we're looking at a Nokia 1994
2110
cell phone from, oh man, that charger. I don't even want to think about.
Do you know what's really hard is it took me ages to get an adapter that you can plug in normal headphones into. It took me forever. And I eventually found this guy in Germany who had a website of old cell phone parts, and he had like 5 available, and I bought them all.
Just in case.
So if anyone's listening who wants a headphone adapter for Nokia 2110, I have all of them.
Wow.
But it's a great phone. And
why do you do this? That's what I really want to know.
It's a long story, but it was so I was living. So where I live is like 4 hours from London, and it's in the countryside. There's no cell phone signal, and then I was working in London, and I was traveling back and forth, and so I got into the habit of I would like respond to text messages when I was in London. And I used my phone when I was on the road, and when I got home, I just, I had no signal, so I didn't bother, and that was kind of my life. And then I thought, actually, kind of being unplugged at weekends, it kind of suits me, and maybe I could like adapt and modify my routine. And I just had this thought, maybe what would be the oldest phone I could get? Like if I was gonna come off a smartphone, how far could I go and be practical? So I actually bought the phone before this. I think it's a 2100. It's that much bigger. And I think then before that is the 1110, which I think is the original Nokia 2G phone. And it's called the 1110. It's a bit of geekery for you. It's called the 1110 because it came out on the 10th of November.
Oh,
so
nice.
1110.
Just past the anniversary.
Yeah, and then every phone after that was like the 2110, 3110, 40. I'm not sure it was the 4110, but 3120. They just kept the numbering. Yeah, and like I'm 2 years into this experiment, and I mean obviously COVID has helped because I haven't been on the road. I haven't needed a phone so much, but yeah. And do you know what? It's actually a really good conversation starter.
It definitely is that. I will give you that.
If you want to talk about digital ethics, then carry a Nokia.
So for those of you tuning in, we're at my house. Charles made it to Germany, and you're on a tour. I guess you're running for the mayor of Germany. Or what?
So you got like 7,000 people now in your MLOps community.
Yeah. And
I'm now the first one to actually figure out where you live.
Now I can be doxxed. Exactly. You're going to publish this information all over the internet.
As I was driving down, I was like giving a commentary of what I saw, because that's what Chad said it would be a good idea.
Nice.
And I was like, oh yeah. And I was like suddenly thinking, oh, I probably shouldn't mention the road name and the house number. Otherwise you will get these kind of data scientists turning up outside.
Asking me. No, probably more likely I'll get some kind of MLOps tooling company salesperson or marketing person trying to get 20 minutes of my time to talk about why I need to have their CEO on the meetup. But
that person will probably be coming from a company that does swag.
Yeah, that is some swag right there from an MLOps company that got bought. So they don't exist anymore.
I missed all this.
They got bought. The consolidation has started, man.
Ooh.
So we've got a few points that we wanted to talk about. The reason that we're here is the 1 year anniversary of Are You a Robot? I've talked to so many people. You've listened to most of the conversations, and we've caught up at the end of each season. And then we've discussed what we've heard. And one of the things that I feel comes up so much that it would be hard for us not to talk about is this idea of education around AI ethics and how like the machine learning engineers or the software engineers or the tech leads, whoever is interfacing with this machine learning and the AI, they need to be educated. And that is how we're going to stop algorithms going out that have not had enough thought put into them and have not really been properly analyzed and like QA'd before they go out into the world. And I want to just throw that out there. What are your thoughts on education? How do you feel this needs to happen or does it need to happen? Is it maybe a misdirect? Maybe you think there's something more important than education, and education is just an easy scapegoat, just like we were talking about with Boris Johnson. It's like, oh, it's not Brexit, it's COVID.
So I'm certainly not going to argue against like more education around ethics to the engineering community, like without question. But I think it's also, I think we need to recognize, and this is going to be a massive oversimplification, but it's something which I definitely have experienced in my career. You have people who are technically trained, who have, you know, really great skill in terms of taking a problem, breaking that problem down and finding technical solutions to that. And you have people who are not technically trained who think in a different way about things. And so I think it would be as impossible taking me and turning me into a data scientist as it would turning a data scientist. Very, very few people kind of transcend both worlds. And I've spent a long time, the last 10, 12 years plus, trying to be straddling both those worlds. And there's very few people who do, and those people I do come across are impressive. And Nicholas Petit, I think, was one that you spoke with. So I think giving some training or education to a data scientist or ML engineer so they have a context to work from, I think is useful, but it's definitely not a substitute from making sure there is governance in place, making sure that there are protocols in place for ensuring there's multidisciplinary approaches to design and implementation. And also, I think recognizing that the sorts of issues that exist are not always issues that can be solved by engineers, and I think that's important. So, education is important, and I think it's going to help, but I think there's other things as well that are necessary.
So then, one of these other things I gather you're advocating for is having different stakeholders in the room, having a more diverse body of people that are helping think things through more. And before the algorithm goes out, they can say, let's look at some other unintended consequences that maybe you didn't realize.
Yeah. And I think one approach which is, I think can apply here is like a more kind of structured approach is red teaming. So, I mean, red teaming is like a really well-known discipline in sort of military circles, but also in cybersecurity circles. Yeah. Like, how do you make sure that an organization has has thought through the potential attack surface from a cyber risk perspective? Red teaming is a very effective way. And basically all it is you just get people who are playing devil's advocate and are trying to second guess the assumptions that the team on the inside who've been doing the job for days in, weeks in, months in, years in, haven't maybe thought through. Yeah. And I think red teaming as a concept and as a structure, it's a really effective way of doing this. And I think red teaming in AI is less about finding the bias or technical risks in place. It's thinking about those external consequences. In many cases, maybe asking the question, should we be using AI at all for this? Maybe there's another approach which is just as effective. And
so I have thought about this quite a bit, and a lot of people have brought up the idea of like having more diverse stakeholders or more different kinds of people in the room when these questions are being brought up or the use of machine learning is being brought up. And the thing is, I had the conversation with, now I'm not going to remember his name, but I have his book on this shelf. Let me go grab it real fast. John Zerilli. And he wrote A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence. And one of the points that he makes in here that I asked him about, and I felt like it blew the whole argument that you're talking about out of the water, was his logical explanation of just because you have more people making a decision does not guarantee the decision will be any more correct. It's not like we have 5 people making a decision, so therefore our percentage or our chance of that decision being correct goes up. There's like no correlation there.
So, I mean, 2 things. Like, one, like super impressed with the level of research you do for the podcast episodes. That's like proper dedication, buying the books of the people coming
This
on.
is just a great book. I bought it anyway. And then after I bought it, I was like, we got to get this guy on.
Okay. And then secondly, you've definitely got me at a disadvantage because I haven't read the book, so I'm not going to be able to do the counter argument justice.
Here,
here.
just read it real fast
sure.
if you want.
So I think the question here is about so it's not just about having like diversity of viewpoints, but it's also having like a culture of inclusivity, with the people whose viewpoints you're soliciting. So it's kind of 2 axes, as it were, you want to be managing there. But you're definitely going to have a better outcome. I don't know. I haven't read the book, but I would definitely take issue with that point. I think that it's coming across there that like just because you got more people, you're not going to get a better outcome. If you've got people who think about the world in a different way, you're definitely going to have thought through the consequences in a stronger sense. And I think, you've had a few guests on who've talked about ESG or corporate digital responsibility and relationship to ESG. I mean, if we kind of forget all the kind of AI ethics, tech ethics kind of world for a second, just look at ESG. If you're managing ESG, you're managing corporate governance, so kind of expectations from professionals in terms of how companies should be run, what a well-run company looks like. That's called corporate governance. And then you've got expectations from stakeholders on social justice questions and environmental sustainability questions. And the best way to start looking at ESG is to, first of all, identify who your stakeholders are. And it kind of may sound obvious, but to some organizations, the most important stakeholder group are the customers. Think Amazon, completely obsessed with customers.
Yeah.
Other organizations are completely focused on the employees. And so there's a difference there. So I think, first of all, understanding who your stakeholders are and identifying your kind of prioritization between those stakeholders. And then secondly, understanding what those stakeholders care about, what their worries and concerns are. That is how you manage ESG risk. And I think the same is true of tech governance. If you're launching a product and you haven't thought through who the stakeholders are of a product, then like you're in the danger zone. Yeah. And if you have identified your stakeholders, but then haven't kind of brought them into the conversation about how it might affect them in real life and what their concerns or anxieties are, then you're really running risk. And if I look back at all the controversies that have happened, all of the things that the big tech companies have been criticized for the last 10 years or longer, it's a failure of those 2 things. It's a failure of identifying the stakeholders and a failure of bringing that feedback loop. It's not a failure of technology. The tech is rarely broken. Like British Airways data breach, that was probably a technical failure. That was like a, diligence failure. But it's like one of the few examples I can think of.
Okay, so talking about tech and big tech, break up Facebook. I know you wanted to get into that. And how do you feel about it? It's so incredible how really, and this was just brought to my attention this morning as I was listening to another podcast, how the CEO of Facebook started Facebook in whatever 2000 something when he was 21 in a dorm room,
Yeah.
and how it's grown and how he stayed the CEO. And he's also grown it to be something gigantic and a little bit out of hand. I am not a fan of Facebook at all, or Instagram. I use WhatsApp a lot. That's the one I can't get off of, but I really have to tip my hat to him because he's come under so much scrutiny and he still is at it. I mean, a lot of people would have just said, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm going to give up. He's got more money in the world than you could ever spend. Like, what is he still just in the public eye? And he's got a bullseye on him every time the media goes out and does something. And so it's quite interesting when you look at it like that. Like, yeah, he's done all this. Not saying that what he did was great. Actually, I do not like it at all. But I will tip my hat to him for there's that COVID. I will tip my hat because what most people would have done is just retired, right? You want to break them up. How do you break them up? What does it even mean? Like, each one is its own entity. What does it look like for you?
Yes, I should clarify. I kind of, when we were planning the session, I said let's talk about breaking up Facebook, but I don't actually. That's not my goal. But I think it's an interesting conversation to be had about like Facebook as an organization, or Meta, or whatever they're called these days. So. I mean, I definitely agree with what you said. I mean, I wouldn't want to be Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, I think, but I think the reason he stayed on is because I've got to believe. I don't know the guy. I've never spoken to the guy, and I guess that's something we're kind of guilty of here. Is like trying to kind of second guess the kind of inner workings of a man that we never have, probably never will meet. But I guess my read on it is that he I think he feels responsibility for his creation, and he wants to help kind of get it to a point where it is a force for good. And I think every time I've heard him speak or seen a video of his view, I mean, the guy, at least the way he communicates like he's on a mission. You know, he's on a mission to connect the world. I believe he truly believes in that being a force for good, and I think he is genuinely committed to getting to a good place. That said, I mean, there's some good things that Facebook are doing. I think the oversight board is a really good model, but its shortcoming is it's extraordinarily narrow focus. It only looks at content moderation, doesn't look at other structural problems that Facebook have. And so I think the reason I kind of said break up Facebook as a kind of topic point is when I was listening, there's a really great Radiolab episode on Facebook, which you should listen to. Everyone should listen to it. And one of the questions on that, I think it was Jad who said, when they were kind of analyzing Facebook, and one of the things that he kind of reacted with was, well, maybe we should just like ban it. Maybe we should just break it up. Maybe we should just stop it. And the way that reaction was just, it kind of sounded so absurd that everyone kind of laughed and then they moved on. And I think that's kind of the problem with talking about Facebook or Meta, is that it seems that the only option would be to ban it or eradicate it. And that's clearly not an option. You know, no one could really conceive about breaking up a private company in such a way. And so we kind of get back stuck into like analyzing Facebook from, I think, in the way that Facebook wants us to analyze it, looking at kind of content moderation and grappling with content moderation and kind of assuming that a platform that promotes the kind of the freedoms that Facebook promotes must be an absolute given right. I think what it does is it deflects us from where the real debate should be, and I think around Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, this is a really important point, but around the metaverse, which is Facebook's new, or Meta's new battleground, this is even more important, and that's that it's not an open platform, it's a closed platform. The only way you can connect to Facebook is via Facebook. The APIs aren't open. There's no way of a third-party ecosystem building apps and building connectivity into the protocols of how you message somebody, how you share pictures, how you access the friend groups that people have. All of that is closed. It's a closed-loop ecosystem. And I think that's one of the things which regulators ought to look at, is whether a communications platform with 3 billion users ought to be closed as a network, or whether we should force it to be open as a protocol. And there's a really good, there's two really good examples of things that you and I use every day, which are open protocols. One is email and the other is the web. No one company controls either of those things. And it means that people can be innovative with the protocol, and the system is resilient, the system scales, the system creates an economy. There's many people who are making a living with websites or spamming people with email, but you know what I mean? It's like it's a resilient platform.
Email services.
Yeah. And so this kind of social media as a genre ought to be open. That's my view. And a consequence of that is it would fragment Facebook. If they were forced to open the protocols, we would see very quickly tens of thousands of Facebook-esque services popping up. People would then migrate to other platforms, and eventually we would end up with an ecology of maybe, 10, 20, 50 Facebook. So maybe it would divide on national lines. Maybe it would be on interest group. Maybe there'd be the music people's Facebook, or the people who do academic research. But
I feel like the metaverse, right? They kind of want to make it open, or it already is open, and so that's one of the things that needs to happen, especially if it's going to be in this Web3 movement, which is becoming more popular day by day. And in that regard, you don't need the centralized Facebook. It's just Facebook is part of the decentralized ecosystem. If I understand it correctly, I can't talk enough on it because I don't know enough about it. But it does feel like the metaverse wants to be more of that. I don't know if the way that Zuck is trying to do it is going to be like that. I doubt it, because how do you make money by doing that?
But I think even the choice of name, I think, is quite an interesting thing. I mean, still today in 2021, people are talking about the IBM PC. Well, we don't talk about the IBM PC, but we talk about PCs.
Yeah.
And so, that kind of brand has stuck for 40 years. But it would have been like, Apple or IBM or Dell or Compaq or one of the kind of early pioneers of the computer industry calling themselves the computer company. It kind of implies that company is
that
the
thing.
genre.
Yeah.
And it's like, Hoover. I talk about would I have a G-Tech? I talk about that as the Hoover, and it's not a Hoover. I don't think I've ever owned a Hoover.
Or Kleenex or Chapstick. Yeah. There's so many of those that have, basically put the stamp on it.
Or Google, I'll Google something, but I don't use Google, but I still say I'm going to Google something. But I think those firms have earned the right to the kind of, synonym. I don't know. I'm too tired, but you know what I mean? I mean, Google earned that right because they are the ubiquitous search engine. And I think for Facebook to claim the name Meta
before it's a thing,
I think that is, and I really hope this, and I start to see a lot of journalists writing about Microsoft, HoloLens, AR, VR, or Apple's move into the metaverse. I really hope that we get off this metaverse nonsense fast, because that actually, that's going to play to Facebook's hands. I think we need to find another name. And besides which, the metaverse, the name comes from a really dystopian science fiction novel from the early 90s. So
does it?
It's kind of disturbing, I guess, in a way. That was chosen, but it's a great name. It's just it shouldn't have been claimed so early. That's my issue.
So at the end of the day, when we're looking at Facebook or other big tech in the US right now, there is some movements to try and break them up. Do you feel like those are going to go through? Is that even going to, should it go through? Should regulators be looking at this more?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one thing, we've got antitrust regulation in Europe and in the US, so we don't use it. If I was Bill Gates, I'd be really pissed off right now because, I mean, he was subject to a huge amount of antitrust in the 90s for good reason. And yet, like, everyone's left Google and Facebook alone. Why? Because they spend a lot of money on lobbying and they spend a lot of money on things which, there's like, investing in education projects, investing in, things which make it difficult for politicians to turn against them. So, I mean, they're very smart. But I think the things that we should be looking at are, vertical integration, I think is a problem.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like Apple, for example, very firmly moving into the semiconductor industry for its own product lines. Again, that means that it is a genius move on their part. And I think under the kind of current way of thinking about how the market around tech is operating, it's smart move. But I think it's potentially harmful to innovation, harmful to the tech industry, organizations being allowed to do that. And also I think firms like Amazon, they shouldn't be in the business of providing data centers and the business of providing an e-commerce platform and be in the business of making the things that are sold on the e-commerce platform.
And then delivering the things.
Because, Amazon have definitely used the data in order to inform their product strategy, which gives them an unfair advantage over their competitors. So I think those things are like, we don't need new regulation. We've already got it. We just need to use the damn thing. Where that case recently was held in the US and the judge threw it out because he said, this isn't antitrust. That urgently needs looking at. We need to make sure that the definition of competition policy is brought up to the 21st century. And then other things like Section 230, that needs looking at again.
Which one was that?
Section 230 is when, an organization like Facebook isn't held accountable for the content on its platform. So if I wrote a whole bunch of, awful things on Facebook and it, caused you harm, Facebook are under no, responsibility for that, even though it's hosted on their platform and even though they're amplifying it with their algorithms.
Which they're trying to change in Australia right now.
Yeah, and I think in the US as well, it's going to be looked at. I mean, it's one of the things even Trump was, pushing for. So it's kind of a sort of interesting kind of bipartisan point around this. But yeah, I think opening the protocols would be the thing. That's the killer weapon, and that's something which could be easily regulated for. And we have precedent for that in. So in the banking industry, we have in Europe, we've got something called PSD2, which forces banks to open up their infrastructure in such a way that it makes it easier for consumers to switch banks. In the UK, we have something called open banking, which kind of does the same thing. So regulation can force change. And I think what certainly the PSD2 and open banking regulation is there to kind of foster innovation, help startups compete against the big banks. I mean, hell, if how hard would it be to launch a social network right now? It'd be impossible unless you have Andreas and Horowitz behind you.
Yeah, completely.
So yeah, we do need some regulation here.
So let's talk a little bit more about regulation and when it comes to AI and ML. How are you feeling about the EU regulation? How do you feel about...
Well, I wanted to ask you that question.
So what
because I guess you're not a fan. That's the sense I get from the way
that I interview people.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of curious. I was like, you've interviewed a lot of people. You've obviously been on the ML ops community. Talking about this as well. Like, what's your sense of that?
So I'm not sure that I have like a strong viewpoint. I think something is necessary, but I also am very much now feeling like a blanket regulation is not the way that we need to go. We need to find use case specific or more, as you were saying, like vertical specific regulation for healthcare, or even more so like a computer vision model that is trying to diagnose lung cancer. that is how specific I think we need to look at things. Instead of saying, oh, if you're using AI and it can be dangerous, well, then it is high risk. And if it has any of these characteristics, then it can be high risk. That I feel like is just putting the handbrakes on things that don't necessarily need to have the handbrakes being put on. And so you should be looking at more of just a way of seeing AI in depth, in much more depth than it is being looked at right now. And I know there's a lot of smart people that are looking at this and creating these regulations. I know that there's been incredible thought put into it. I don't understand why it wasn't broken down into different verticals and it was trying to be a blanket regulation, which is where I'm at right now. As far as, of course, like the ML engineers and ML ops community, I think the majority of them don't like it because they feel like it's going to stifle their innovation or it's going to unnecessarily slow them down, which is always the qualm that you hear. That's like basically the number one argument whenever regulation comes out. And talking to all the smart people on this podcast, I also like the arguments that they make where it's like, no, but if you have clear barriers, that's going to enable you to go faster. That's not going to stifle your growth in any way or your innovation. So I see both sides. I don't really have like a strong opinion about it should be this way or it should be that way. The only thing that I do think could be better is the vertical and making it a bit more like each use case has been thought through.
I think for the European Commission to regulate vertical by vertical will be really hard. So I think you have to kind of push that out to certainly for the regulated industries. I think like kind of what the use cases would be in financial services needs to be regulated by financial regulators. And the same with the kind of, for medicine, the European Medical or Medicine Authority should take responsibility for that. I'd have to reread it, but I think from memory there is some sort of expectation, or maybe it's in the Data Governance Act that there would be like a kind of a baton pass, but like a kind of here's where the responsibility of the Commission level starts and ends, and here's where it will be handled by industry regulators. But I think kind of I've heard this kind of come through. I've seen it on the MLOps Slack channel, and I've kind of seen it in some of your interviews. I guess the thing about this is going to piss a few people off. I wonder whether like some of the people who are criticizing this stuff actually like have whether they understand it enough. And
that's
I think this is the thing. Is like somebody was like I remember somebody was saying about how it's just really badly written, and I was like, okay, that's an interesting point of view. And I looked at their profile and and I thought, okay, maybe if they're a lawyer, then maybe that kind of opinion would be kind of qualified. But they weren't. They were like a tech nerd, and it's like, well, yeah, but it's not written for you. It's written like you got to. And he was like arguing about like, yeah, but it should be written in such a way. It's like, mate, you don't understand how law works. So just like, I'm not going to bother trying to argue with you on this one. Just drop it. You haven't got a fucking clue what you're talking about. And I think there's a bit of that, and I think part of maybe the failure here is around the not the actual draft text, but the kind of the communications plan and the communication with the AI tech community. Because there's certainly, from a corporate level, you've got a lot of lobbying going on, a lot of kind of responses at the kind of corporate level. But I think even those people are far removed from the people on the front line building this stuff. So I think that's kind of one problem. And then very quickly, the second problem, like, really the AI draft regs are only asking for like kind of three things, and the two of those things are really basic, which is if you're going to do this stuff, risk manage it and quality manage it. That's all it's asking for. And like I've yet to meet anyone who would argue against that. And like, what's the big deal? If you're going to write this stuff, think through the consequences. It doesn't take long. And all it's asking is have some sort of process, a system ideally, that can do the quality management and the risk management. And I think there's no reason why any organization, even like a one person startup, shouldn't be doing that, regardless of whether it's high risk or low risk. I think that's just surely best practice.
That makes complete sense. And I agree with you on every point there. I also like the idea of pushing off, like what you were talking about with the EU regulation, pushing it off to the certain sectors. And then they can look at all the different use cases, because as you mentioned, there are so many use cases that can be applied to machine learning. And each day there's more. You figure out, oh, well, we could probably use machine learning for this and make it better. So,
and I think it's part of the problem is the permutations of like, if you were to like limit it by use case, then people would be arguing, yeah, but this isn't exactly that use case. This is like a slightly very different variation. So I think it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard. And I think I took a lot of comfort from the Paul Nemitz conversation. I think I have definitely questioned the democratic process and the apparatus of state and been frustrated with it. And I heard him very passionately say, you've got to have faith in institutions, you've got to trust in institutions. And I thought he was bang on there. And I think the tech industry, we forget sometimes, actually, we kind of championing democracy. On the other hand, we don't let democracy do its job. But I just hope they get on with it. And I hope the AI reg doesn't die a death through the parliamentary process, which it could do.
Yeah, also. I mean, let's talk about the other thing that we wanted to mention, which was obviously not on there, and we've talked about it before many times, is the use of AI in military. And it wasn't on there, and you figured out why it wasn't on there. We've talked about that, or you have a theory as to why it wasn't on there. But where are you at right now with that whole thing and the ability for drones to kill someone without having a human in the loop?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking about this yesterday at a conference in Switzerland. So one of the most innovative things I've seen is actually an organization, Ethos, who are based in Geneva, who basically they're what's called a proxy voting advisor. So they work on behalf of pension funds, and they research issues, and then they basically advise the pension funds, this is how we think you should vote. Because obviously within a company, if you own 20% of the shares, you have 20% of the vote. Simplistically, you have 20% of the voting. So they then tell the pension funds, we think you should vote in this way. And that way they kind of manage to kind of campaign for change and campaign for better outcomes. And actually in 2020, Ethos published a paper which set out their expectations of the Swiss market. One of those expectations, Principle 5, is talking about sensitive activities. And it's I think the first time I've actually seen a financial organization like really try to push companies, not just tech companies but non-tech companies, to kind of make clear statements about things they will not be involved in. And obviously the most clearly sensitive activity is the use of AI in military context. And the point I made yesterday at the conference was, it's a bizarre thing because public support for banning the use of automated weaponry or military usage is like absolutely overwhelming. So it's kind of strange that in a democratic process hasn't picked up on that. I guess that's my observation. I'm sure there's like national security reasons why that's a thin end of the wedge or whatever, but I think it should be the risk of it all going wrong. And I think for me, the interview with Wanda and Richard, was it? That was made that case so powerfully that there's such an important point of principle, and also it's if we really do believe that it's a slippery slope, and a bad acting country would hold us sort of ransom, then maybe we should just have more faith in international cooperation and we've achieved it with landmines, which were equally horrific.
Chemical warfare.
That's what we need, a Geneva Convention on AI.
Yeah, that's a fascinating subject for sure. So finishing up, I wanted to talk about the way in which we all see AI and the ethical issues that surround AI when we're coming from different backgrounds. And something for me, because I grew up in the US, could be fine. Even just the area that I grew up in the US and the socioeconomic class that I grew up in the US is totally fine. But then for you, growing up in the UK in your little world is absolutely outrageous that you would even think that way. So how can we both use that to our advantage and not get stifled by it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier about understanding your stakeholders and identifying your stakeholders and then trying to understand them. But this is definitely true, and I think I had this conversation at lunch today.
With yourself?
No,
you said, was this when you cleared out the restaurant by coughing?
No, that was breakfast. So this is going to be hard for you to hear, I think, being American, but American culture is so dominated by racial tension that it's sometimes, I guess, it must be hard for an American or being in America to kind of argue. I'm not saying argue against kind of racial concerns, but to kind of not to like understand that they're not as top of mind in other parts of the world. And certainly in Switzerland, I think one of the things that, certainly in the conversation today with somebody was about how they felt that they totally against racism, consider themselves to be anti-racist, like actively try to find ways of taking away boundaries and barriers. But they found that actually for them in Switzerland, in a different context, there were other questions about AI which were more top of mind. And that person had a particular experience dealing with an American organization where this turned into but why is this not a priority? And it's like, well, it might be a priority for you over there, but it's not a priority for us over here. And I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist in Switzerland. I'm sure it does, and I'm sure there are problems. But I think it's a particularly American anxiety around some of these questions, which spills out into the wider AI community. And so I think part of that is about understanding that it's just different in different parts of the world, different for people with different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And there is no such thing as right or wrong. I think the thing about ethics, and I think, who was the guest that you had? Oh my goodness. I can see his face, and oh my goodness, he talked about cooking, and ethics is like salt. You want to kind of sprinkle it.
Yeah.
Philosophy is like salt, and you want to have like a little sprinkle of it. It's not.
It wasn't Nicola.
It wasn't Nicholas. It was
starts with the
Enrico.
So Enrico.
So I mean, I think he made this case really well that ethics is an activity, and it's conversation. I mean, there's two things I think we as people do really well. You I'm sure you and your wife will disagree with me. There's more dimensions to this, but it's my limited mind. There's two things. Like we have this ability with language, which is a way of us kind of communicating our thoughts, transcending the physical space that our voice can act in, but also over time and space. Our language is so powerful. And then technology is obviously the other thing that gives us amazing power, leverage. But with language, we have the ability to kind of influence, change someone else's point of view, consider another person's perspective. And you and I are engaging in this now. People listening to us will be engaging in this now. Yeah. This is ethics. This is the activity we're in. Yeah. And I think we just need more of that. We need more people understanding each other's points of views, understanding where the lines are. I've learned so much in the last year from some of the podcast guests. I mean, Lewis Bird, one of the first episodes, I sat and listened to this, and there were some really powerful things I took away because I don't share the same experience as him. I don't have the similar context. You and him have a much closer context because you're both from the United States, but even then there was difference. And I think that's really the goal, is recognizing that there's 8 billion people on this planet, and there's 8 billion points of view.
Lives. Yeah.
And I think that's why I'm really pleased that we're making this thing happen, because our small community, our growing community, hopefully will be having more kitchen table discussions as a result of this, and we're progressing that cause.
It's funny you talk about these 8 billion people on Earth. I was just mentioning with a friend about how when I was in a city again, it reminded me of how many people are on the planet and how each one of these people has their own lives that they're living. And they're going off and doing their own thing. And he was like, there's a word for that. I think it's called like sonder. And so I didn't fact check him on the word. I could now, but we'll put the definition of sonder in the description below. And it was really just one of those moments where you have a realization, right? And as I'm looking around, I'm by myself in the city and I'm seeing people that are in groups, and you're together for that moment, and then you go off and you do your own thing. That person does their own thing. And so it's fascinating to think how we are connected in that way, and we are very much individuals. And so
this was in San Francisco.
This was with no acid, no weed. It is legal there, but I did not go and sign up to be a guinea pig for their psychedelic tests at the University of Berkeley. But this was all pure, just from the secondhand smoke of the homeless people.
But that's the thing. I mean, I was going to say that San Francisco is like the birthplace of the beating, throbbing heart of our tech industry, and yet it's a place that's it's just such huge inequality. I was shocked, really, because for me, it's like the city on the hill, the city paved with gold. All these big tech companies. I went to Menlo Park and Cupertino, and all the tech companies I know and love and hate. I kind of saw their corporate headquarters, and yet it's in the middle of just massive. And so it's this weird thing that the birthplace of tech, well, at least it's not the birthplace, but kind of the real center of it has its own deeply rooted social problems, and I just wish that there was a little bit more introversion and kind of maybe fixing. If the tech industry was headquartered here in this region, I think it might be a bigger force for good than where it is.
What's really interesting is how people talk about they are paying a lot of money to try and fix the problem, but what they're doing is not working. They're not going about it the right way. And
is money the answer?
Exactly. It's like, what are the ways that they can go about it? Because throwing a bunch of money at it is not working, obviously. So, I mean, I hate to end on this note though, but I think it's time to finish this podcast up. It's been quite a bit that we've been recording for, and I want to just say, this has been awesome. Being able to talk to so many bright minds, as you said, expand my viewpoint. I like to think that I'm a very open-minded person, so getting to hear from so many people along different axes of beliefs and how these specialists will come in and school me on all these different pieces of AI or regulation or military use of AI. And I never experienced that in my day-to-day without having those conversations with people. So it's been so cool to get to do this podcast and learn from these people. So that's what I will end on.
Well, that's good. And I've learned a huge amount. And this is like weird, like I said this in the car when I was coming over, like I've spoken to you like a ton of times in the last year and a half. So I kind of felt like we kind of knew each other to some extent, but also like, I've also sat through 20, hours. 30, well, maybe 40, 50 hours of conversations that you've had with other people. So I've definitely got you at a disadvantage, and I probably know you more than me.
You know my tics, all of my stutters.
Exactly.
That stuff.
But I have learned, and I'm somebody who's, I consider myself to be kind of already kind of deeply in this space. And, I think that's the great thing, is that you can always learn. And this is why it's been such a great project. And I think not just seeing the experts, but also seeing the process through your eyes as you're unraveling some of these questions and grappling with some of these questions. And let's be honest, some of them some of them are really hard. I think some of them have been, much simpler, much clearer. But I mean, some of them have been really hard. And I've definitely learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners have as well. So
we will continue.
We'll do it for another year until we get bored.
Yeah. Yep. Until I come visit you in London next
you're
year,
very welcome.
or in,
You're very
in
welcome.
the UK in your little farm with your cows and all that good stuff. So
Good.
This is us
Should we
signing
end
off
with the
fist pump.
That's it.
There it
Okay,
is.
good stuff.
All right, man.
Boom. Thank you, dude.